My name is Amanda Reynolds, and I was 31 when the foundation of everything I thought I could rely on crumbled beneath me. I had just been laid off from a mid-sized marketing firm, a job I had poured my blood, my nights, my sanity into for nearly 7 years. The layoff notice came in a sterile envelope, the kind that felt more like a verdict than an opportunity. "We regret to inform you." I reread the words over and over, willing them to mean something else, some loophole where I hadn't failed, some error in judgment by someone else. But it didn't. I was unemployed, adrift, and for the first time in my adult life, terrified in a way I couldn't soothe with promises or self-motivation. The bills had stacked up quietly, patiently, like predators waiting for my defenses to falter. Rent was overdue by 2 weeks. My car, my lifeline to the city and interviews, was making a new rattling sound every morning, a warning I could not ignore. And my savings, gone, entirely depleted. Last year, I had spent nearly everything on my mother's medical bills, an emergency procedure she had insisted wasn't a big deal, which ended up costing a small fortune. I had watched my bank account bleed down to nothing, and now, staring at an empty balance, I felt a weight I couldn't lift. So I did the only thing I thought a responsible daughter would do. I called my parents. "Mom, Dad, I just need some help to get through this month," I said, my voice intentionally steady, even though my stomach churned. "Maybe around $12,000. I'll pay it back once I'm back on my feet, I promise." I thought they would understand. I thought that the sacrifices I had made over the years, the care I had given, the patience I had practiced, the silent support I had offered whenever they needed it, would at least earn a moment of sympathy. But the silence that followed the end of my sentence was so thick it nearly pressed the air from the room. Then my mother's voice cut through the quiet. It was calm, precise, and utterly cold, like a scalpel through the fabric of my hope. "Amanda, you should be relying on your husband, not us. That's what a real wife does." The words landed on me with such force I could feel them in my chest, heavy, suffocating, and final. It wasn't just a refusal. They were judging me, belittling me, defining my worth by their narrow, outdated ideals of what a woman should be. I had never been a woman who waited for permission to exist, yet in that instant, I felt my identity collapse. Before I could even form a response, my father's voice entered, tinged with irritation that somehow felt rehearsed. "You've always made bad financial decisions, Mandy. We can't keep bailing you out." Bad financial decisions. That was the diagnosis from the people who were supposed to be my lifeline, my family, my protectors. My mistakes were catalogued and dissected in their minds, but my struggles, the stress, the sleepless nights, the panic over bills, the mental toll of being unemployed, were invisible, irrelevant. Their words weren't just a refusal, they were a condemnation of my very existence. I wasn't asking for a handout, not in the way they assumed. I wasn't asking to live off them or to shirk responsibility. I was asking for compassion, for acknowledgement that life sometimes throws people into chaos, and even strong women need help. But compassion was foreign to them. I hung up, but I didn't just feel rejection. I felt injustice, the kind that twists in your gut and burns in your chest. I stared at the cracked screen of my phone, seeing my own reflection blurred in the glass, and I realized something I had been avoiding for years. My parents only valued me when I looked successful on paper, when I was convenient for their pride, when my victories reflected their image of what a daughter should be. They didn't care about me as a person, only as a symbol. And in that moment, a deep, searing anger began to coil in my stomach, hot and bitter. It was anger at them, yes, but also at the world for demanding perfection, for holding success as a prerequisite for love, for turning familial bonds into a ledger of achievements and failures. I was 31, and yet I felt like a teenager again, being judged for wanting a simple lifeline during the storm. But beneath the anger, there was a sharper, quieter realization. This was the kind of lesson that would define me or break me. My parents had chosen to turn their backs, to prioritize ideology over humanity, and in doing so, they had made a choice for me as well. Either I would surrender to the resentment, or I would find a way to rise without them. I pressed my palms to my eyes and exhaled, letting the tears fall freely, because I had no one else to shield me from this grief. I was alone, yes, but in that solitude, I felt a flicker of clarity. They weren't the safety net I had imagined, and maybe they never had been. And while anger burned, it also sharpened me. It reminded me that if I survived this moment, I would have to rely on one thing only, myself. My brother, Ethan Reynolds, was everything I was not, or at least everything my parents made sure I understood I wasn't. From the moment he could speak, he was the prodigy, the gifted child, the one whose grades, accolades, and later, career triumphs were endlessly paraded as proof of the family's success. He was the investment banker, the brilliant strategist, the golden son. A boy who could do no wrong because my parents insisted on seeing him through a lens polished by favoritism and denial. I grew up hearing the comparisons, subtle, cutting, and relentless. Why can't you be more like Ethan? He would never waste money on frivolities. Ethan thinks things through. You act impulsively. Even when I excelled at school, even when I graduated with honors, the praise was always laced with this invisible qualifier. Not good enough, not like him. I learned early on that my accomplishments were never my own. They were benchmarks against his perfection, standards I was doomed to fail. So when my parents refused to help me, when they told me I should have relied on my husband, when they lectured me about my so-called bad financial decisions, I wasn't shocked. I was hurt, yes, but there was also a bitter predictability to it. Their love had always been conditional, tied to how well I conformed to their vision of success. And then, in the same conversation where they denied me, my mother casually mentioned that they had just helped Ethan with some business liquidity. Business liquidity. That's what they called it. 4 words that sounded like prudent financial advice, but in reality, it was hundreds of thousands of dollars in cold, unreserved cash handed to my brother without question, without scrutiny, without hesitation. Nearly $400,000, she said, to invest in a deal they refused to explain, a deal whose details were irrelevant to her because he was flawless, because he was Ethan. Meanwhile, I was scrounging coins out of the glove compartment to buy groceries. I was stretching my credit cards to cover rent. I was skipping meals to make ends meet, so my mother could pay for his whims and call it prudence. And it wasn't just the money, it was the message that cut deeper than any financial strain. My worth in my family's eyes was tied to obedience, passivity, and appearances, while Ethan's worth was intrinsic, unquestionable, absolute. I began to avoid family calls. Every holiday, every birthday, every gathering was a theater of performance. Dad would sit in his chair, puffing out his chest, recounting Ethan's latest strategic acquisition or the clever maneuver he had executed at work. Mom would smile, perfectly poised, eyes shining with pride as if she had personally engineered his success. And me? I sat quietly at the edges, a ghost in my own family's story, chewing resentment like stale bread that stuck in my throat, tasting of bitterness, shame, and anger all at once. That hypocrisy was suffocating. They had no problem praising, protecting, and financing Ethan, even when it came at my expense, but they treated my struggles as self-inflicted failures, as though financial hardship or misfortune were moral failings instead of realities of life. I tried to rationalize it, tried to find a soft edge to their reasoning. Maybe they thought I could manage, maybe they wanted me to be independent. But the stark contrast between their treatment of me and Ethan made that impossible to believe. Every interaction, every remark, every monetary decision reinforced a pattern that was impossible to ignore. One child was worth every sacrifice, the other was a cautionary tale. It was during one of these painfully ordinary dinners, where the conversation revolved entirely around Ethan's accomplishments, that I felt a shift in my perception of my family. I realized that my resentment wasn't just personal, it was structural. Their love, their attention, their support had always been transactional, contingent on who reflected their pride and who reflected their shame. I had spent decades trying to meet impossible expectations, trying to earn a seat at a table I would never be invited to, and in doing so, I had been systematically devalued. And yet, despite the mounting frustration, there was a strange, quiet numbness that settled over me. I stopped expecting fairness, stopped hoping for empathy. I became vigilant in silence, careful to detach my own self-worth from their judgment, even as it tore at me. I had begun to internalize the lesson my parents seemed determined to teach. That love was conditional, that family was selective, and I was expendable when my struggles inconvenienced their illusions of perfection. It was in this fragile, simmering state, caught between anger and disbelief, pride and despair, that the call came that would shake the fragile equilibrium of everything I thought I knew. A call that made the contrast between Ethan's privilege and my vulnerability impossible to ignore. A call that would expose the raw hypocrisy I had been living under for decades. And in that moment, I felt the weight of everything: the sacrifices, the omissions, the endless comparisons, the silent judgment, all crashed down at once, leaving me hollow, enraged, and utterly alone within the family that should have been my sanctuary. It was a Thursday morning, overcast and ordinary, when my phone buzzed with a news alert that made the world tilt beneath my feet. Local investment advisor arrested for embezzlement scheme, $2.5 million missing. The thumbnail photo was unmistakable. Ethan, handcuffed, pale, his expensive suit was rumpled, tie askew, eyes wide and hollow, staring past the camera lens as though seeing the consequences of a lifetime of arrogance for the first time. I couldn't breathe. My stomach twisted violently, my heart hammering against my ribs as if trying to escape. For a long moment, I simply stared at the screen. I could feel every memory of their favoritism, every quiet humiliation I had endured, every day spent scraping together pennies while they funded his indulgences, come crashing down in a wave of surreal disbelief. The golden boy, the untouchable, the flawless, the family prodigy, was not untouchable anymore. The pedestal my parents had built around him was crumbling, and for the first time I saw the fragility beneath the gilded surface. Within hours, my phone rang relentlessly. My parents, first dad, then mom, then back to dad again, each call more urgent, more desperate. Not a single word of shame, not a whisper of apology for the years they had turned their backs on me when I needed them most. No, their concern was selfish, practical, transactional, panic-driven, purely about salvaging their image and their finances. "Amanda, we need your help," my mother said, her voice tight with anxiety. "Ethan's bail is $600,000. We're completely drained after the IRS audit. You have a business degree. Can't you liquidate some assets, get a loan? We don't know what else to do." I had to swallow a laugh, bitter and hollow. They wouldn't loan me $12,000 when I needed it to keep my apartment. They had lectured me, belittled me, blamed me for poor decisions when all I had asked for was temporary support. And now, they were begging me to save their criminal son, the very boy whose every misstep they had excused and enabled, the one who had been pampered with hundreds of thousands of dollars they had denied me, as if I had been a minor inconvenience in the grand scheme of their image. My mind raced, a mix of disbelief and simmering anger. I could almost hear the echoes of every holiday dinner, every forced family celebration, every proud smile they had given Ethan while I sat quietly in the shadows. And now they were calling me the same daughter they had dismissed, expecting me to shoulder the consequences of their indulgence, their favoritism, their blind faith in a son who had clearly been above accountability. There was a strange, almost surreal hope that bloomed amidst my anger, a glimmer of poetic justice. Ethan's fall was undeniable, public, irreversible. The golden boy, the flawless investment wonderkind, was exposed as fallible, human, and accountable. And I who had endured quiet suffering, who had survived financial despair and emotional neglect, suddenly realized that the universe, in its cruel but sometimes fair way, had tilted the scales. I felt a cold, clarifying satisfaction just beneath the surface, a sense that perhaps for once, I was the one with clarity and they were the ones scrambling blindly. Still, despite the vindication simmering inside me, I did not answer immediately. I let the phone ring over and over, each tone another echo of the past. Every call they had ignored when I had needed help. Every lecture about my supposed inadequacy. Every casual disregard for my struggles. I let their panic accumulate, let the urgency weigh on them, because in that pause, in that quiet, I realized something profound. The power dynamic had shifted. I was no longer expendable. I was no longer the invisible, disempowered daughter. I thought of all the times I had been told to manage on my own, to be independent, to shoulder responsibilities I had never created. I thought of the nights spent worrying about rent, counting coins, making impossible decisions, while Ethan's needs were always immediate, unquestioned, privileged. And now the situation was reversed. I was not obligated to fix their mess, not now, not ever. I was not their emergency fund, their moral safety net, their last resort. The hope I felt was not about wealth or vindication. It was about agency, about finally recognizing my own strength and refusing to be used as a prop in a family drama I had never written. As their calls multiplied, my pulse steadied. I allowed myself a faint, almost imperceptible smile, not at Ethan's suffering, but at the awareness that I finally understood my worth. The golden boy had fallen, and for the first time, I wasn't scrambling to rescue anyone. For the first time, I could watch, fully present, as the consequences of their choices unfolded. The The scales had begun to tip, and though the world outside might see only scandal, I saw clarity, justice, and the faint stirrings of a life no longer dictated by their favoritism. And in that quiet, momentary clarity, I realized something else. Hope isn't about them recognizing you. Hope is about recognizing yourself. I arrived at their house that evening, the sky darkening in slow, deliberate strokes as if the world itself had paused to witness the confrontation I had rehearsed in my mind for years. The driveway was lined with the familiar hedges I had helped prune as a teenager, neat and precise, the outward image of order my parents had always treasured. Inside, the air was thick, perfumed, and heavy with denial, the scent of lilies and expensive candles masking the rot of hypocrisy. My heart thumped, but my steps were steady. I knew exactly why I was there and what I had to say. My father sat rigid in his leather armchair, hands gripping the arms as if the polished oak could anchor him against the storm he had unleashed in our family. His eyes were red, not from anger but from the sudden, unaccustomed vulnerability that comes when control begins to slip. My mother, poised and untouchable for decades, now sat on the couch, trembling, a tissue clutched tightly in her hands. Silent sobs shook her shoulders, and for the first time I saw her as a woman stripped of pretense, stripped of her armor of superiority, showing only raw fear and desperation. "He didn't mean to do it," she whispered, voice breaking, almost pleading. "He just made bad choices under pressure." Bad choices. That's what they called it now, the euphemism for betrayal, greed, and a lifetime of enabling. I felt the old ache of years of invisibility coiling in my chest, but this time it was tempered with clarity. I did not need their approval. I did not need their forgiveness. This was not a plea. This was a reckoning. I stood there calm, composed, my hands folded lightly in front of me, every line of my posture betraying none of the fury simmering beneath. The words I had held like embers for decades finally sparked, and I let them flare, bright and uncompromising. "You raised him to believe rules don't apply to him. You raised a criminal, not a son." The words hit like a hammer on stained glass. My father's head snapped up, shock and fury mingling in his glare, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. He had never been confronted with this before, not with me, not in all the years of my silent endurance, and yet I did not flinch, did not falter. "You told me I wasn't a good wife because I asked for help when I was struggling. You lectured me on responsibility, on morality, on what it meant to be a proper daughter and wife." I continued, voice steady, each syllable deliberate. "But you defended a man who stole from innocent people, who gambled with their lives and livelihoods, and you call that family? That's not family, that's hypocrisy." Silence descended like a physical weight. Their house, usually so filled with the hum of curated perfection, was now empty but for the tremor in the air that followed a confrontation long overdue. I saw the recognition flicker across my father's face, mingled with disbelief. My mother's hands trembled, clutching the tissues as though they were life rafts, and I knew she had finally realized the magnitude of her moral blindness. I took a step toward the door, a gesture as simple as breathing but loaded with meaning. They wanted a savior for Ethan. They wanted me to erase their failures, to absorb the consequences of decades of favoritism and poor judgment. But I had my own life, my own integrity, my own hard-won understanding of my worth. I was no longer the child who cried on the phone, pleading for help, dismissed and belittled. I was a woman who had survived, who had endured, and who now refused to be exploited. My mother's voice cracked behind me, desperate and pleading, fragile in a way it had never been. "Amanda, please, we'll lose everything." I paused, one hand on the doorknob, turning just enough to look back, letting the weight of my gaze communicate what words could not: years of neglect, denial, and invisible suffering. "Then maybe you'll finally understand what it's like to have nothing, and no one." And with that, I walked away. Each step was deliberate, a drumbeat of liberation, echoing through the halls where I had once been invisible. The air outside was sharp, scented with wet leaves and autumn frost, crisp and invigorating, carrying the promise of clarity and self-possession. I did not look back again. The house receded behind me, a monument to lessons learned the hard way, and I realized fully and completely that triumph is not measured by their acknowledgement. It is measured by the courage to speak, the resolve to walk, and the clarity to finally reclaim yourself. For the first time in years, I felt truly free. It's been 2 years since that day, the day I finally stood firm, the day I walked away from the home that had witnessed a lifetime of conditional love, favoritism, and quiet betrayal. 2 years since I spoke the words that had been buried in my chest for decades. 2 years since I reclaimed a sense of self I hadn't realized I'd lost in the shadows of my brother's accomplishments and my parents' judgment. Ethan is convicted, 5 years in federal prison for embezzlement, for a web of decisions that ultimately collapsed under the weight of accountability. I won't pretend relief doesn't mingle with residual disbelief. The man once hailed as infallible, the family's golden boy, now confined to a system built to punish the kind of hubris they enabled. My parents? They sold their home to cover the legal fees, liquidating their physical legacy while leaving emotional debts unpaid. Their silence toward me has been absolute since that day, an unspoken acknowledgement of the rift or perhaps a refusal to confront the consequences of their choices. Either way, I stopped needing their approval long before they stopped calling. I've rebuilt my life deliberately, intentionally, like one constructs a home from scratch after fire has ravaged the foundation. I started a marketing consultancy that reflects my values, my experience, my voice. It's not the glamorous corporate world that once dismissed me, nor is it bound by the judgment of people who equated worth with wealth and appearances. Instead, my firm specializes in helping women-led startups discover their voice, craft their identity online, and compete on merit rather than legacy. There's a quiet satisfaction in this work, a resonance that fills the spaces left empty by years of neglect. Every project is a small victory, a reaffirmation that I am not only competent but essential to the success of others. My apartment is modest but warm, nestled along a river that flows unceasingly, indifferent to past mistakes and future anxieties. I watch the water from my window in the early mornings, letting the rhythm of the current remind me that life moves forward whether I dwell in regret or embrace growth. I furnished it carefully, surrounding myself with objects that inspire and comfort rather than impress or compete. Each detail is a declaration. This space is mine, curated to reflect the person I have chosen to be, not the one my parents once attempted to define. Daniel, my husband, stands beside me, steadfast and unshakable. Through layoffs, financial uncertainty, and the emotional toll of a family fractured by favoritism and criminality, he remained a constant, a partner whose love is measured not by superficial achievements, but by loyalty, empathy, and respect. There is an intimacy in knowing someone sees your worth without conditions, without comparison, without the need to validate through hierarchy or inheritance. In him, I found an anchor, a shared understanding that partnership is mutual, not transactional. Sometimes strangers or colleagues ask if I miss my family, the traditional unit I left behind, the parents whose approval once dictated my sense of worth. I answer honestly, and it surprises people with its simplicity. I miss who I thought they were. I grieve the illusions of safety, of unwavering support, of unconditional love that never truly existed. But I do not grieve for the betrayal or the favoritism. They belong to a past that no longer holds sway over me. In these years, I have internalized a truth that had been elusive for so long. Blood does not define loyalty. Character does. Integrity, empathy, honesty, the willingness to uphold one's own ethical standards even when convenient or expedient. They are the measures of a person's true worth. I surround myself with those whose actions align with these principles, and I allow myself to flourish in the clarity that comes from deliberate choice rather than expectation. I do not feel anger anymore. That fire, once consuming, has been transformed into lucidity. I recognize patterns, understand motivations, and observe consequences without the emotional weight that once threatened to drown me. My parents' absence is not a void. It is a boundary I established for my own survival. The closure came not in their acknowledgement, but in my ability to step beyond the entanglement of disappointment and claim a life of autonomy and purpose. When I shut that door years ago, I wasn't rejecting my parents. I was saving myself. It was an act of preservation, a reclamation of dignity, and a declaration that my life would be governed by clarity, respect, and self-determination. Every decision I make now, every boundary I enforce, every venture I undertake is a testament to that moment of resolve. I wake each day with intention, not obligation, and in the quiet rhythm of a life rebuilt, I understand that triumph is not about vengeance or spectacle. It is about the courage to speak, the fortitude to walk away, and the wisdom to live fully in the light of your own worth. I am Amanda Reynolds, unbound, unwavering, and finally at peace.